In Sharmila Rege's work, Dalit Women Talk Differently, what she presents is a critique of this idea of difference and walks us through what a Dalit feminist standpoint position is. She begins by setting context on a significant shift that was occurring in feminist thought in the 1980s and 1990s. What was this shift? It was an increasing visibility of black and third world feminist work. Now, although there was visibility, it is not necessary that it was received. It was received as well as it should have been by the people who were seen as the forebearers or were at the forefront of feminist movement. So mostly in the Western states, you had white feminists whose idea of white feminism was something that was seen as being a homogeneous idea of what feminism entailed. Now, when they were asked to confront the challenges that were posed to them by black and third world feminists who were also a part of this movement, what we saw was a reluctance on their part to speak about these issues. The justification that these white feminists gave were as follows, and it seems rather valid. They said that they did not want to appropriate the voices or the struggles of black and third world feminists. However, this justification, although it may have stemmed from a place of good intentions, did not necessarily translate into something that would have brought forth positive action. Because what ended up happening was that this reluctance, which stemmed because of the following two assumptions. Firstly, that racism or the addressal of the racial identity was something that was the sole responsibility of black feminists and third world feminists, because white feminists were not privy to these challenges or did not directly experience them. Or the second assumption that another faction of feminists had, which was that the addressal of sexism automatically encapsulated within this broad umbrella the addressal of racism. That is, to become anti-sexist, you would have to be anti-racist, and therefore it was not necessary to bring this up separately in conversation. These were the two assumptions that marred this judgment, this idea of reluctance, this idea of refraining from speaking on these issues. However, what ended up happening was Western feminism reaching a state of stasis, because there was non-addressal of certain issues, or because there was absolvement of the responsibility to speak upon these issues by people who were seen in the forefront of what was essentially thought of as a homogeneous feminist movement. It drove home the idea that even within the feminist movement, not all those partaking in this movement had equal struggles, and therefore, when it was viewed as from the perspective of the obstacles that they would face, the challenges that they would face, and what the ultimate goal was, we found that the obstacles that were addressed or identified did not necessarily lead to the same outcomes for the people within the movement. Now, what Rege then goes on to point out is that to a large extent, this stasis can be explained in terms of the alliance between feminism and post-structuralism or postmodernism, because it was the category of difference that came in postmodern thought that became the center of feminist theorization. And Sharmila Rege's work addresses this category of difference and why it is both imperative and why it may have its detriments, thinking of the feminist movement in terms of this difference. Now, when we're looking at India, the political pitfalls of adopting this postmodernist approach and this post-structural approach was that there was a rise of a rather communitarian or culturological approach to looking at any prominent political movement in India. Post-Orientalism studies also point out to the idea that post our independence, our movements were largely classified under the post-colonial identity. So anything that was seen as pro-India and anti-colonialism was seen as something that was of importance. However, when you're going with this approach of identifying one single evil and talking about how it is that the people of a nation or the people of a community were banding against it, what you are sometimes failing to do with this rather simplistic approach is identifying all these other evils that may have also prevailed in the society. So while colonialism brought with it its own sets of problems and its own sets of challenges, in pre-colonial India, caste-based domination, gender-based domination, and class domination, which were all problems, were root causes that came to be ignored because they did not fit into this anti-colonial narrative. And we were applying a framework called the Sadian framework to view this problem. And therefore, when you're doing that, what happens, especially in the context of a lot of non-Brahmin movements and movements that were by or on behalf of women, is that they come to be largely ignored, or they become invisible because they had utilized the colonial law, they had utilized the colonial system of justice, and they had utilized the colonial administration as major resources to seek equality. So when this is not fitting our anti-colonial narrative and we are excluding it from discussion, or we are not seeing this as a part of, say, discussion and eradication of some other major problem that was prevalent in society and continues to prevail in society, we make these causes, we make these movements invisible in history. And within this frame of invisibility, we are also making invisible the lineage of a lot of movements that have continued today. So when scholars conceive the recent autonomous assertion by Dalit women as a different voice, the first question that we must now ask is, was it truly different? Or was this a part of a continuous ongoing process that had movements that preceded it that we are not aware of because they are not a part of the mainstream, because they did not fit into the anti-colonial narrative that we have so far been viewing our history through the lens of, and therefore were made invisible. Now, the second part of Sharmila Rege's introduction basically talks about what was happening in the 1980s. Now, in the 1980s, independent India was marked by the new explosion of caste identity. Caste came to the forefront of conversations, and the consciousness of this identity and how it fit into different theoretical and political narratives also led to debate of caste and its role in other movements of social transformation. Now imagine this. You are a Dalit woman. You have, like all of us, you are not one, you may be working for a particular movement, you may be a part of multiple movements that all cater to different facets of your identity. But what you ultimately want is reform, what you ultimately want is transformation, what you ultimately want is alleviation of the opportunities that you're afforded for these various different parts of your identities. Now, the fact that you're joining different movements or you're advocating in different movements, the reason you're doing that is because somewhere the intersection of these two movements is very small, or it is not being acknowledged. So if you have two circles over here, one that alludes to your identity as a Dalit individual and the other that alludes to your identity as a woman in India, you have the broader feminist movement that is fighting for the rights of women, but maybe is largely ignoring your caste identity or is refraining from speaking about the unique challenges that a Dalit woman would face within this sphere. And then you have your Dalit identity, which is another circle, which talks about or advocates for equality in terms of caste. But at the same point of time, while trying to do that, it is ignoring your struggles as a woman, as a Dalit woman. So you have these two circles that are advocating for different parts of you, but the intersection of these two circles, which is where you stand, is a very, very narrow space. And you do not have people advocating for the causes that are unique to both at the same time. And that led to the rise of autonomous Dalit women organizations. And when you had not just the rise of these women organizations, but the assertion of these women who wanted multiple rights, who wanted reform, keeping their perspective, keeping this circle in mind, we found that initially in the 1980s, both of these larger, broader movements that they were part of also engaged in debate and discussion on how this could be something that they brought into their framework, they brought into their ideology, and how it is that they could work towards affording Dalit women in particular a sense of agency when it came to fighting for these movements. However, what ended up happening again, because it's a very complex issue, you are a part of a very specific circle or a very specific bracket, is that this assertion threw up a lot of crucial theoretical and political challenges, and this was besides underlining the Brahminism of the feminist movement or the patriarchal practices of Dalit politics. And although this initially propelled a serious debate which drew responses from both left party-based organizations as well as autonomous women organizations, this debate soon slowed down. It came to a state of rest, and came to a state of relative silence, because the question that these broader movements were asking is, who needs to speak for them? So there was, I wouldn't say there was absolvement of responsibility, but it became so that the mantle of talking about these issues then fell on this small intersection, which was the Dalit feminist movement. And what this did for feminist politics is it suggested that feminist politics and the ideologies were not homogeneous. There was not one ideology or one standpoint that came under the purview of feminist politics in India. There were multiple plural feminist standpoints. And this brings us back to the postmodernist idea of a difference, and how it is a difference that serves as the center of what feminist thought is all about. So the separate assertion by Dalit women's organizations comes to be accepted as one more standpoint, and within such a framework of difference, what ends up happening is that issues of caste become the sole responsibility of the Dalit women's organization. And when there is an absence of exploration of each other's standpoints, it hinders the dialectics, both of a revisioning of contemporary feminist politics as well as sharpening of the position put forward by autonomous Dalit women's organizations. So what Regi is talking about is that while the identification of this difference is good, when you are limiting it only to the naming of difference, and you are not seeing ways in which contemporary feminist politics and autonomous Dalit politics and autonomous Dalit feminist politics can both derive from each other and work on broadening that point of intersection, what you're essentially doing is isolating a larger movement. She covers different facets of this argument within her paper, which is what our other members will be talking about. She begins by talking about how the category of difference came to be a focal point in feminist theorization. And then she talks about how this is meant as backtracking of some core forms of feminism. The second part that she's talking about is the exercise of historically locating the lineage of the Dalit feminist movement. So over here we are looking at the Satya Shodhak movement, and we're also looking at the Ambedkarite movement and how women factored in to these movements. The last part that she's looking at is a critique of Chatterjee's work of the national resolution of the women's question. And this analysis is something that has come to inform much of the theorization on gender in this nation. And so she tries to critique it and see where it is that the Dalit feminist standpoint factors into this, and how this individual has been able to cover this particular concept in his resolution of the women's question. Now, after all of this, what we're trying to also look at are some of the issues at stake, like the Mandal Masjid phase of the women's movement, where it was argued that the assertion of women's voices in 1990s in particular brought up significant issues for the revisioning of feminist politics. So what we are primarily looking at, like I said before, was this idea of difference and the assertion that Dalit women's voices is not just an issue of naming their difference or what their point of difference are, or identifying what their obstacles are. Because naming of difference or saying that this is different and this is how this sort of deviates from what, not traditional, but what the more mainstream version of feminist politics in India is actually fighting for, will lead to a narrow sense of identitarian politics. So this assertion is rather, or should rather be said, seen as centering on the discourse on caste and gender and viewing the discourse on caste and gender through a Dalit feminist standpoint.